week in the boardroom. Brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on what we think will be a very interesting show today. We're going to look at the What Directors Thinks research highlights. And joining me for this show is Julie Daum, who's the board practice leader for Spencer Stuart and a co-author, if you will, of our research. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today, Julie.
Thank you.
And Spencer Stuart, the research is nothing new to you guys. You have the big Spencer Stuart Board Index that you do every year, and that's for the top...
The S&P 500.
S&P 500. And then I know recently you've also done a study on the digital directors.
Yes, and we've also done some work looking at high-tech companies and other industries. So we've expanded from the S&P 500.
Well, today we're going to focus on the What Directors Think, which again, collectively we do annually, and we take a look at this and try and get opinions of what directors think. And we spend time going on, looking at those issues that we think are most relevant. And it's one of the larger research studies that's done. So I thought we'd sort of talk about some of the highlights that came out of that. And the first thing I thought we'd talk about, we asked about what directors felt were the most desired skill sets of what they were looking for their next director or that they should have on the board. And interestingly enough, the three things that were the top three issues were financial experience, industry experience, and IT experience. Any of that surprise you at all?
No, I think all boards are still looking for financial expertise, even though after SOX everybody went and got at least one financial expert. But you cannot expect one person to chair the audit committee forever. So most boards look to have more than one financial expert, and so somebody with complementary financial skills than the one person they have. So if they have a CFO, perhaps they look for a banker or former banker. Industry experience seems like it should be obvious, but it hasn't been. And I think the Citibank situation a couple of years ago pointed that out when people looked and said, "Oh my goodness, they have no financial people on the board."
A lot of independents, but
no
right.
people from the industry or who understood the industry. So I think people are circling back and looking more for industry knowledge. And IT is not a surprise in a world where technology is critical to every business. The other thing that we hear people talking about in terms of IT is related, but different, very different, is looking for people who have a digital or marketing or social media experience. That tends to be more in consumer-related companies, but boards are looking for that. And the other thing we hear and see boards looking for people who have international experience, particularly right now in Asia.
Yeah, it's becoming a very small world, and I would think that there's a lot of both ways, U.S. companies that want foreign directors to represent that interest, and foreign companies that want U.S. directors.
There is just a more cross-border interest, even though it's hard to do. And the mechanics are very difficult, but yes, there's much more interest both ways.
Well, we had another topic that was interesting. We had asked them about diversity, and specifically we asked the question of whether they believe that a diverse board drives performance. And interestingly enough, 75% of directors felt that a diverse board drove performance. And we asked a little further, and 40% say that they're looking for gender diversity, and 34% said they are looking for racial diversity on that. But diversity really covers even more than just gender and race. It also is, we like to say, diversity of thought, and of demographics and age and a lot of that. So, but the 75% sort of surprised me a little bit that there's that much recognition.
It is, but I guess people are finally coming around to understanding that having a room full of people who all look alike isn't as productive as having people who have had different experiences and aren't just U.S. centric or whatever it might be to them that is diversity. So I think most of us now recognize that having different points of views and perspectives, helps decision making rather than hurts decision making. I think, so it depends on how you define diversity, and I think people are trying to define it a little more broadly than just looking at women or minorities. Having said that, boards are still interested in the issue of bringing in more women into the boardroom, because our numbers in the U.S. are still pretty small and much smaller than most countries in Europe now, where we've seen quotas and other policies coming in.
Yeah. And early reports are that that's not changing that much, even though I think you and I felt that there was some momentum in this thing. The numbers don't really say that.
Yeah, we've just gone through a preliminary look at the proxies for this year, and it doesn't look, I think the percentage of women directors will go up a tiny bit, maybe 0.5%, but the percentage of new directors who are women has not changed. And I thought, we did think there was momentum. Spencer Stuart recruited our 1,000th woman in December of last year, and we are already at 1,070 for this year. We've recruited many more women this year. I feel like there's more interest, but the numbers just don't show that. So people are thinking about it, but it's one of the reasons I think that you're not seeing it come into play is because there is so little turnover on U.S. boards. And so what's happening is last year there were only 291 new spots in the S&P 500. So no one is getting into the room. There's just very few new seats. So it's not just women and minorities who are not getting in, people from other countries or people who have technology. All those things boards say they want. If you don't have an opening, or you get an opening once every 3 years, you really can't get all the things you want to get into the room. There's just not enough spots.
So why the limited numbers? Are people just staying longer, or?
People are staying longer. Boards have, in the U.S., the way boards have mostly do turnover is through using retirement ages. And what we've seen is boards have pushed their retirement ages up to 72 and 75. And as a result, what we're seeing is boards are getting older. And tenure, which is another issue, is going up. So you have people who have been on the board a long time, and for some people, for some shareholders, for example, they worry about long tenured directors being independent. So that's what we've seen in the U.S. is this push up of, with the pushing up of retirement ages, just what you'd expect, older boards and many more people on boards who are retired.
Well, one of the questions that we asked in the survey, which was a highlight, was we asked directors what their wish list would be for the agenda. And the responses, the number one response was long-term strategy, then came growth and scaling the business, CEO succession, and global strategy, again, looking at direction, and then business continuity and crisis management. When you think about it, none of those are a big surprise when you think about what the duties are for directors.
Right. No, and that's right. I think boards have, for a while, they were really worried about, I don't want to say compliance, but they were focused on some of these other issues. And yet these are the things that you mentioned that they know they're responsible for. So I think boards have said, wait a second, we need to get back to and spend more time on the issues, on strategy and less on the audit committee. So I think boards are really refocusing back and trying to figure out how they make sure on their agenda that they spend time on these issues. And some of them, strategy, what they're doing with strategy is trying to spend more time on it. What they're doing with CEO succession, we find, is rethinking it so that they don't only think about it when their CEO is 2 years away from retirement, that it's an ongoing discussion that they have, that they spend the time and energy to get to know the internal candidates, that they talk about it annually so that there are no surprises. They know who's in line, they know how to develop them, they know who are potential outside candidates. They have a much more thoughtful process. Not everybody, but more and more boards are really rethinking that issue. So it's more time on strategy and rethinking CEO succession.
We another topic that we talked about, which I find this is an interesting one, we asked directors when they felt that someone was overboarded, in other words, was serving on too many boards. And I found it interesting that about 2/3 believed that if you had 4 or more, you would be put into the overboarding class.
Right.
And that even 3 or more, about 1/4 of them felt that that was the case. What's interesting about that is ISS looks at it as 6 boards.
Right.
And if you're a CEO, they will vote against you if you sit on more than 2 boards. But so when did you ever think that the directors would be more conservative than the proxy advisors are?
Right. But I think some of it just comes down to, board work requires, it's more time intensive. There are more phone calls, there are more committee meetings. And so if you have a director who serves on 4 boards, just the scheduling of phone calls becomes difficult and becomes frustrating to the other directors. And there's also times where you need people to jump in besides just on a scheduled committee call or meeting, and so if somebody has a lot of outside activities, then they can't serve on that special committee or they don't have the time. So some of it is a recognition by directors that everybody needs to pull their weight, and they want people focused on that board, right? And so it's not a perfunctory job. It's important, and you need time.
Yeah, and I think the challenge there is looking at worst case, because maybe I could serve on 4 boards if everything went perfect.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But
That's right.
The problem is it's not going to go perfect, and if somebody's in a merger and another one has a regulatory investigation, all of a sudden your once a quarter has gone to once every 2-week meetings, and next thing you know, you are, quote, overboarded on that. So it's tough to look at it that way on what's, sort of what's the worst case.
Yeah, but there's always the worst case happens.
Right.
You just don't know when. It will always happen at a bad time.
Yeah. We just have a second here, about another minute, but I wanted to ask you, because this sort of relates to everything we talk about. We asked the directors what was the best retirement approach. Always a sensitive topic when we're talking about directors, but about 29% said have a policy that all board members must adhere, so keep that firm. About 26% have a retirement policy but allowed limited waivers, and then that was about 26%, but almost half said set a retirement guideline with the ability to evaluate on a case-by-case basis, which you'd have to be a proponent of, because one size doesn't fit all, but that's also the best way to abuse their retirement, is everybody starts waiving, and then all of a sudden you have directors that feel bad, well, why does so-and-so get waived and I don't get waived? So any of those numbers surprise you?
Now, this is a very difficult subject for boards to deal with. And so they say, well, we're going to evaluate, and an individual will say, I'll know when it's time for me to go, or people say, we'll have those tough conversations, but it's very difficult to do that to somebody that you've spent the past 8 years with and are on a team together. And people find it very difficult to have those conversations. So they like to have rules, but having a rule of 75 is very difficult, because not everybody at 75 is as relevant as they were necessarily if they joined at 45 as a new director, with a digital background. 30 years from now, are you really going to want this person?
Right.
So there's just it's a tough thing to have, and I think what people are nervous about is the long tenure. And so if you continue to use the 75, you're going to have people who've been on boards for a long time. And I think so I've heard some interesting solutions to this recently. I'll mention 2 of them. One is a board that's talking about not having a retirement age, but having a retirement suggestion, but saying that the average tenure on the board cannot be more than 8 years. So you can keep somebody for 15 years if you think that person is absolutely critical, but it affects some of the other people. So to try to manage around that number rather than saying it's a one-size-fits all and everybody has to leave at a certain age. And the other thing is people are talking about going to a more of the way the UK has it, where you can serve on 3 3-year terms, and after that you're no longer independent. And so there's some discussion around kind of both of those.
Well, you know, I have not been the most popular person in the world because I've been talking about term limits, you know, relative to this. And I like the idea of having sort of 2 terms that you can serve, so that obviously you're going to be elected annually, so that plays precedent over anything, you know, these days. But I think because of people going on younger and younger, you can't have a director serve 30 years.
Right.
I think that you're going to see every year an uptick in the term limits, whether boards like that concept or not. I think that's going to be one of the things that's coming down the pike. So
I think we're going to see it also.
Yeah. So, listen, Julie, thank you very much for joining us. Again, this research is fun to do. Spencer Stuart will be sitting down shortly to come up with our new questions for next season. We'll try to have them to be as provocative as these were. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show this week. We'll be back again next week for another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member and committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.